Welcome, and we are going to start with a blessing. You notice that I am without Talis and Philin right now, and that's because this was a last minute decision. I had planned on catching up on my Z's this morning, and I knew that Harlan was not going to get the text that I sent out, and so I got on at 7:30 to try and catch him at the pass, and everyone else on. So here goes. All right. And hopefully you are now seeing my share. Okay. All right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
I mean,
Amen.
All right. So if I'm not mistaken, this is kind of where we're going here on this, but it looks like we did that. Hold on a second. Here we are. There we are. Very good. So we had learned some issues. We had first of all started with those animals and birds and insects and fish that were permissible. And now the Torah is sort of shifting things into the issue of tuma and tahara, the issue of impurity and purity. Something that a lot of people, when they get to that kind of thing, they just get lost and feel it's anachronistic and they aren't really so interested. And yet it's so interesting that sometimes these are the very heart and soul of what's going on. And as I said, I realized that I actually think this is the issue that tries to connect physical to the spiritual, and in fact has implications of immortality. That being aware and conscious of this particular space, which involves something called purity and impurity, which is not to be confused with being filthy in some kind of physical kind of way, although there sometimes is, without any question, a connection. We are talking about spiritual purity. That's the best I can do in terms of trying to find language to describe this. So we realized then that there are levels. We now discovered that there are actually levels of impurity, just by the way, as there are levels of sanctity too. There are levels of holiness too. And here Rashi explained that on some levels, it only requires waiting until nightfall of that particular day. Whether the fact of nightfall being also, we know that darkness and night is also a metaphor for death, whether that's somehow connected with the fact that one has to wait until nightfall. If it's a more serious issue, one has to wash one's clothing, again, washing, etc., etc. You know, there are deeper meanings to these particular things. I can tell you that there are levels of impurity that go beyond that. Some of you may already be aware of that. Obviously, going to the mikveh, washing yourself in a special pool of water, also involves a cleansing from purity. We know, of course, that washing oneself with water is a way of taking care of physical dirt, etc. So there's that idea. Some have said that the mikveh is symbolic of the amniotic fluid, and that it's like a rebirth, and that's definitely out there. All these sorts of deeper ideas. And we know that, of course, when it comes to issues of guilt, right? And guilt can be a sort of impurity, right? So that being reborn, feeling clear of that guilt, having been washed of that guilt, sometimes trying to actually get rid of guilt can just really dog a person. And it's very, very hard. And this is something that obviously psychologists have to work very hard in terms of working these kinds of things through. So there's all this connection. And the fact, of course, I'm hoping that I'm making a fairly good case now as this being a very, very deep kind of thing going well into the psyche of the human being. At any rate, this is what the Torah is going to move on. And in the fact, the next Parsha is going to deal with leprosy. It's going to start off with childbirth, again, transition here, coming into life, and then moves into a very detailed section dealing with a very severe kind of spiritual impurity called sara'at, which is translated as leprosy, although it is not the leprosy that's a clinical thing, clinical disease. So let me go on now. V'zeh lachem, and this shall be to you, hatameh, that which is impure, b'sheretz hashoretz alaharetz, with regard to swarming things that swarm over the earth. And here we go into the actual animals themselves. So it's not necessarily, by the way, insects, right? In fact, none of these things are insects. They have to do now with reptiles. Although the mole is not a reptile, but you'll see that in some cases they are. Okay. Hacholed, the mole, the ha'achbar, and the mouse, the hatzav, and the great lizard, the minehu, according to their kind. Let's take a look here if there's Rashi on this. So, bezelachem, it starts right over there. Hatame. So he says, kol tumot halalu, with regard to all of these categories of impurity, Einan le'isur achila, they aren't just coming to forbid eating, consumption, ingestion, ela letum'a mamash, but for actual impurity, right? That a person now becomes intrinsically impure by touching these, or by touching their carcasses. Liot tameh, that is by coming impure, being impure, b'maga'an, by touching them. V'ne'esar lechol truma, and if in fact one comes in contact with them, Rashi now tells you the practical application of this state of impurity, one is now forbidden lechol truma, to eat truma. Truma is a donation that is given only to priests. Priests receive truma. Truma is the first, so let me give you an example of truma. Essentially, it came from harvesting grain, okay, that when the grain was harvested and taken to the place, to the barn, and the pile of grain was smoothed over to prepare it for taking to market, they would take the average of it doesn't say in the Torah how much is to be truma, but the rabbis figured out that 1/50th was considered to be the average. That is about the amount of the grain. 1/50th of the pile would go to the priests as truma. Sometimes, if the person was generous, they could make it 1/40th. If they were stingy, they could make it 1/60th. But making it less than that meant that you now were violating the laws of Truma. So they gave you sort of a bracket of amounts to donate as Truma. This isn't where it ended. So this now had to be given to a priest, a local priest. The priest himself could only eat this in a state of purity. So if a priest, for example, had now touched one of these animals that is being mentioned in this section here, he would have to wait. He'd have to cleanse himself. He'd have to go to the mikveh, and he'd have to wait until nightfall in order to consume this truma. He also had to be very careful to guard the truma to make sure that it didn't become impure, that some kind of thing happened to it to make it impure. So he could not be in a state of impurity. The truma could not be a state of impurity. He and his family and his Slaves, his Canaanite slaves, I believe, were permitted to eat the truma. Again, would have had to be in a state of purity. However, a priest couldn't invite a friend over who was a non-priest and say, here, let's share the truma. Israelites, Levites, Israelites were absolutely forbidden from consuming truma. There's a whole bunch of laws, so I'm giving you a little bit of a sense of this truma idea. If I were to try and stand back for a moment and try to draw some other conclusions from it, it would appear to me that our relationship to food, that in some ways, this is something that tries to sensitize us through what we do or what these laws are in terms of our relationship to the food we eat, and perhaps to recognize how miraculous the whole process of sustaining ourselves is, both the natural in terms of nature and being able to grow grain and the ability to turn it into flour, etc., etc. The whole digestive system that we have. If your digestion isn't working well, you know exactly what a miracle it is for the digestive system to process that food and allow and sustain us. I believe that this is not a justification of the law. It's just saying that the laws stand by themselves. The issue is how do we derive greater lessons and deeper lessons from these laws? So truma, kodshim. So he's not allowed to eat kodshim. So to tell you now, we mentioned that there were degrees of impurity. There are also degrees of holiness. Kodshim refer to sanctified meat. In other words, an animal that had been, or grain, or oil, or any or spices that had been donated to the temple, especially as sacrifices. So there were also parts of a sacrifice that the priest was supposed to consume. In a case of shlamim, the family also was also allowed to, or privileged to, eat from the sacrifice as well. Again, if anybody had touched one of these kinds of animals, they were not going to be permitted to eat kodshim. And finally, velikanes lamikdash, nor to set foot in the temple, in the sanctuary, in the tent of meeting courtyard. So again, you have to sort of meditate as to what exactly are they trying to, what is the Torah trying to convey beyond the validity of the law, just simply as it stands? What are the greater implications that are going on here? Okay, so he's trying to now go on to, we're getting back into names. Remember, we had names of birds, and trying to know what these are, what these animals actually are, based on what the Torah writes and gives their names. It is a whole art and a science, and one has to do research, and the Talmud goes out of its way to try and help us know, in order to be able to apply these laws. It isn't just a question of reading these things in the Torah. The issue is, again, that great mitzvah of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, has to do with taking these laws and actually practicing them and being in a process. And that's a process, that's a journey, right? And I love the metaphor of taking these laws that are here written in the Torah, that means they're in heaven, and taking these ideas and then actually living according to these laws. That's bringing the Torah down from the heaven down onto the earth. And I would add one thing, this was a realization fairly recently, that when we use the term Elohim, that term for God, Elohim, we are talking about this process. In other words, if you are willing to take these particular laws and actually try to live by them, you are then, and because you're doing it because out of a love of God and a fear of God and a recognition of God's presence, etc., that is making God your Elohim. And when you're saying the Shema, one of the best interpretations I have at this point is that you're addressing Jacob and saying that the Elohim, the Adonai, God who was his Elohim, is also our Elohim. And that just segues right into the next statement about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. When you do that, you make God your Elohim. And so this now becomes a very, very deep spiritual practice in terms of gaining significance as a human being, because you are important enough. You are important enough to do this, and it matters. So there's the sermon for the morning. So I see, we'll just finish this Rashi, and then we'll call it morning. So Hacholad, he says, Mostila. So whatever that word means in Old French, the Yiddish is an ein Wiezel, sounds like a weasel to me. So again, we're talking about this classification of animals. So mole, weasel, I don't know if they're related. At any rate, that's working on these translations. Vahatzav, and he translates it as the French word actually is, I think moot is how it's sometimes translated. It does mean a toad in Old French. I think in modern French, it also means toad. And then the Yiddish is ein kreta. That is also like a toad. Shedomer letzvardea. Interesting, he goes on to say, that looks like a tzvardea. Remember, that was the first of the, or rather the second of the plagues, the frogs. That's the word that's used there. So it has to do with frogs. So amphibians, I suspect. And that's where we will leave it for today. And if you have any questions before I go off the record, just tell me. Does anybody have a question? Okay, so I'll just mark the place, and God willing, we'll be able to pick this up next year. Okay. So stopping the share, stopping.